Thank you, Karen, for your very interesting presentation. Um, I appreciated the effort in applying philosophical tools for the evaluation of this specific case study. There is now quite a wide literature of philosophy of science applied to neuroscience, especially within the mechanistic perspective. That, of course, is the focus of this webinar series. But often the examples are in a quite limited number of cases. We read much about Hodgkin-Huxley equations, O'Keefe's place cell, and so on. So I think it's very important to extend the spectrum of cases. Now, I have a few reflections and questions. My first one is thinking that you are using arguments and criteria from Krever and Gardner that are about mechanistic explanations of phenomena. So I'm not sure that the study by Pedersen team is really aimed at explaining. It seems from their own word that possibly not. In their abstract, they say our data set provides the first functional description of the excitatory synaptic wiring diagrams of a physiological, relevant, and anatomical well-defined cortical column at single-cell resolution. So they talk about functional description, and they add, in order to understand how information is processed in these cortical microcircuits, it will be essential to quantify the underlying synaptic connectivity. So it seems that their work is fundamental for the understanding of how information is processed, but it's not by itself the understanding of how information is processed. And then later on, they wrote here, through multiple simultaneous in vitro whole cell recording, we specifically and quantitatively investigated the excitatory synaptic circuits. Our data provide a first order cellular resolution description of the excitatory microcircuits of the mouse. One may assume that the fundamental target phenomena at hand is whisker perception. And indeed, the study is very important in the context of understanding whisker perception, but it's not explanatory about this phenomena, I think. There is probably a partial answer to my question in the description of what you call component 2.2 of Pedersen team strategies. You correctly pointed to the background knowledge of the causal pathway from whiskers to layer 4. So in some sense, one can assume that in vitro excitation of layer 4 neurons has a causal correspondence to whiskers sensory activation. However, the experiments are not aimed at reproducing the kind of patterns of signals in layer 4 similar to those caused by whiskers. We know there is quite a wide literature on how the barrel cortex organizes representation of whiskers signals, mainly orientation-specific deflection, relation between orientation-specific response and non-specific response. Furthermore, there are studies on how the dynamic of deflection directions can lead to the computation in the cortex of location and shape of objects, furthermore on the radial organization maps for multi-whiskers correlation and so on. So it seems to me that the interesting phenomena, whisker perception, is not the main target of this study. Of course, this does not mean that the study is not important. It's very important, but I'm not sure how relevant is the use of the idea of mechanistic explanation of Crever and Darden. A second point I would like to discuss is your position that one of the main posits of the case study is to take into account the electrical behavior only, discarding all the rest. And as you said now, this may open a very wide philosophical discussion about what is the role of the dominance of the electrical epistemology in neuroscience. You say that the system of practice of electrophysiologists have half a century of tradition, but in fact this is in part of an even older and established interaction between electrical engineering and neuroscience. Here, just a couple of examples. But this is a very widened discussion that takes too far away. Still, I think that in the idealization of taking into account the electrical behavior only, there is much more left outside in this study, and the authors are well aware of what is missing. In the conclusion, they wrote, our results must therefore be considered only as a beginning, and much more experimental data is required, blah, 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 including how it, the barrel column, develops behind postnatal days, how it changes through alterations in sensory experience. So my point is that a very big aspect that is discarded is the time dependence on purely the electrical activities. And there are many evidences of how important is the dynamics in the electrical properties of the barrel cortex. There are this study of Patel, for example, that show how different are the responses during adaptation, repeating several times the same excitation. Well, everywhere in the cortex there is the phenomenon of adaptation, but the point is that adaptation affects differently the selectivity to the velocity of deflection and to the direction of deflection. The sensitivity to velocity decreases with adaptation, while the selectivity to the direction increases. So there is quite a strong influence on just the repetition of stimulation on the electrical responses of neurons in the C2 barrel columns. And of course, even more, as the author mentioned, there is a big changes in the electrical response according to the maturation days by days of the barrel cortex. For example, here in this study, there is a difference between juvenile and adults. With the adults have a much more refined orientation map of selectivity with respect to the direction of deflection whiskers. And there are specific studies on the distribution in the layers of the responses of neurons to deflection, depending on the age, here at a difference of 4 days only. So time is also an aspect neglected in the studies, but the authors were well aware of this idealization. Okay, my third and final point, reflection, is about the move to a computational model. I'm not convinced that this passage is so direct and straightforward. The point of computational models of cortical microcircuits is a very long and debate issues, starting from David Marr, and most of the core components of the cortical circuits are made by excitatory and inhibitory neurons. It's not a problem at all that this study measure excitatory contribution only. But the point is, when you build a model, if you discard the inhibitory neurons that, of course, are present in the brain slices that you measure, this is quite a strong assumption. And I would like also to mention that in the philosophy of neuroscience and mechanism, there is some special attention to what should be criteria for a computational model for being mechanistic. This one by Kaplan and Craver is quite popular, the so-called 3M constraint. I don't know if this constraint is met or not by the model in this case study, but it's just to point that the step from the table of data to the computational model may raise some philosophical objections. And of course, there is a varieties of computational models, and according to what the authors say, they use a rather simple model. They used a single compartment computational model, also because the data were not so detailed to allow for more realistic models. They say our result must therefore be considered only as a beginning, and much more experimentation is required before we can assemble a realistic working model. And they mention correctly Markram, which is of the same institute in Switzerland, and this is a result of a reconstruction of the somatosensory cortical map of the mouse in a model of Markram, where is included all the range of cell types in the cortical layers. So I think that probably the passage to a computational model is possible critical. Okay, and with this third point, I have just minor questions. You raised the point of the idealization in assuming that over the 6 measured cells, there is a direct causal relation between one cell and the other. And you ask why is ignored the possibility of intermediate neurons that cause in an indirect way excitation of the other cells. I guess that this may have been ruled out by timings, because I saw in the graphs of the paper that there is a very, very detailed timing of the signals, down to less than 1 millisecond. So probably timing is enough to rule out if an excitation is caused directly in phase with the single excited neurons, or is caused indirectly, possibly. Okay, and I finish. Thank you again for your interesting talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Okay, Karen. Karen, you can. Well, yeah, pretty much. Lots of material to discuss. Looking forward to. Maybe we can move again to the Karen's slides. So if you have to. Okay, so Karen, if you just share your screen again. Okay, thank you. Great.
Thanks for your questions. I especially really like the last comments you make about perhaps timing is enough to justify why they can ignore other possibilities. So I have to go back to paper to figure out whether that timing part is actually enough to do the job. If that's the case, then I do need to revise the argument I make in the paper. So that's very good. Thank you. So for the 3 big questions you raised, okay, so let me start with one thing. So let's go back to my slides. I want to clarify one thing first, is that in this part, when I start using Quaver's standards and strategy, and I say mostly nothing like, I also in my paper, when I have to, I will mention mechanism schemas. For me, I take them as the specific type of causal representation they focus on analyzing. And as you see that when I write my paper, and also when I do my slides, I hope I'm skillfully enough, but I do have that strong intention to avoid endorsing the whole package of their account of mechanism explanation.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't use the mechanism explanation or explaining very often in my paper or even in my slide, because I intentionally avoid that, because when I read a paper and there are other related papers, I think the notion of understanding is better, it fits better with what they do there. And as you actually point out in your comments that you don't think they're aiming for explaining. So I totally agree with you. And so then I need to clarify how much I endorse with the Craver and Darden's work. I only want to take out the standards and strategy they use. And for a very strong reason behind my mind is that I think the standard strategy they propose are actually very useful. And my previous reading of Craver, I have to confess, Craver and Darden, especially Craver, I have to confess that I think I understood his or their view as they are aiming for like really the more complete is better, the more details better, that kind of account. But as I read carefully of their 2013 books, I realized that at least the book in 2013, they have maybe adding more nuanced considerations. A lot of them involve contextual factors. So I see that they say completeness, but they actually aiming for acceptable degree of completeness, and they go into a lot of detail, tell you in this context, how do you look at the practice, whatever. So doing this, I actually hoping that we can, at least for me, and then so someone who have the similar impression of their work, to move away from this impression of that mechanistic account of explanation demanding the more complete detail, the very realistic model of the target system. I want to kind of distance them from that strong commitment. And at the same time, of course, not endorsing the whole package of mechanistic explanation, because as I said out very clearly, all I need is that I want to discuss what standards, strategy philosophers of neuroscience can use when they encounter a case study. For example, this case in neurophysiology. And I'm based on your comments, I know you're very knowledgeable about all this in related studying in this field. And I'm sure you probably, I guess you probably agree with me as the data you showed that there's a progression, like even the case study I focus on, and many papers, scientific papers like that, they will always know at the end that we need more data in order to move on to the next stage. It's almost become a common phrase for neuroscientists to say at the end, so they feel comfortable that they can draw a conservative conclusion at the end. And so it's interesting that we're facing this scientific work. It's basically an open-ended process, and they just keep going on and going on. They want to make they create model one after model, always improvement or whatever, improvement or digression from the previous model. And so I think the more I think about it, I don't think it makes sense to think, you always think the case study you analyze has to be that complete, the most realistic model in order to be able to say, oh, this causal representation is a good one. So right now, I want to untie this. When we want to say a causal representation is a good one, because it's epistemically successful. But what counts as epistemically successful does not, it's not evaluated in terms of whether it's the most complete or realistic model, but we need to appeal something else. And that's why I thought the part of the Craver and Darden standard and Portocini's analysis of idealization is helpful in this case. And so you see that, so when I use Craver and Darden's work, I don't bring in the 3n constraint to use, because I think that is the example where, you know, it makes it sounds like they aim for the most realistic and complete model in order to say this is a good explanation. In some cases, some scientists actually aim for explanation, but I think many cases I read in neuroscience, it's not the case. Their text is very confined with a certain context. And then once you get the context fixed, a lot of times they want more understanding. And so for us to make sense and be able to evaluate the case study, it's really better to focus on understanding than explanation.
Okay.
And so for the time-dependent part you mentioned, I agree with you, because in this case, I only analyze their in vitro study part. Of course, they do a lot of in vivo recording, and I haven't get to that part. And once you bring in vivo recording, and that can take care of how they deal with it, how the time dependency part, and how this brain circuits dynamically their dynamics in view of the sensory input online. So that's another set of the case study I need to analyze. I do aware of that. So very good. So is that roughly answer?
Yeah.
Oh, your question? Okay.
Okay, so now the second, as we told you, the second discussion, Lena Kasner is here now.
Yeah.
She sent us some questions. So maybe the best thing that we read this question, and maybe you can answer. Just for a brief question, so I just read it, and then you can answer. So the first question is a very general question having to do with your use of components, the word components. So the question is this a fairly general issue I had when reading the paper, especially the first half, was the talk about components. Do you simply mean strategies here, or slightly differently put? What's, on your view, the relation between a strategy and a component, and what individuates a separate strategy? So that's the first question by Lena. Maybe you can answer this, and then we can...
Component, for me, it's pretty generic use, because I can call it units as well. Not much depends on that. I just want to, because case study, I want to have a better organization structure when I present a case study, and as I divide it into 5 parts, 5 units, or 5 components, can help the readers enter into the case study faster and get to the main point more effectively. That's all.
So the word component is not theoretically laden, so to speak.
No. Yes.
Okay. Let me suggest that maybe, given that you introduced Craver, and Craver speaks a lot about components.
I see.
You might want to just to disambiguate to choose a synonym, but that's my question.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. And
okay, so the second one is a bit more theoretical, and is about your definition of idealization and abstraction. So the question is the following. I struggled a bit with your definition of idealization and abstraction. Can't idealization also drop details? If I idealize, say, temperature regulation of a heating system, and do not take into account the small temperature deviations, because I'm looking for the temperature to be constantly within a certain range, I haven't abstracted, or have I? So that's the question.
Can you repeat the example again?
Yeah. If I idealize, say, temperature regulation of a heating system, and do not take into account small temperature deviations, because I'm looking for the temperature to be constantly within a certain range.
I'm putting the questions on my screen so I can share them.
Yeah, that's maybe also another.
However, whatever clarification about what
Yeah,
the distinction between abstraction and idealization will be a nice answer. So if you can spend some works on that would be great.
But in a moment you will also able to see the question, so maybe it's a bit better.
Okay. So question 2.
Yeah.
Can you read it? Okay.
Temperature. To be constant range. I haven't tried it.
If you have some question about the question, then maybe we can skip it and move into another one. So that's no worry. Yeah.
Okay, let's move to the third one.
Yeah.
I see if I can come back to it, but let's move to the third one too, because I really struggle understanding the question.
Yeah. So, wanna read it?
Yeah, but you have to.
Yeah, it's here. 3.
Okay, so it's about the ontic epistemic discussion. What's your take on the ontic epistemic discussion, especially in 3.3? You seem to defend some sort of conciliation. Do you?
Yes. I said, right. Yes, right. I leave out the part about the ontic discussion in my presentation because I don't think I have time to cover that part. But in my paper, I talk about it a little bit, but not substantially as well. I'm not even sure about the premises together. Will also make room for ontic. Yeah, welcome traversal parts. I'm not sure either. Though the emphasize complaint is correct in your drawing book, correctly argued for some constraints. Several pillars will deny that there is some role to play. So I think well that's separate two things. One is how do we understand ONTIP version and what Cravers actually endorse. So that starts with how we understand ONTIP version. So let's get the core of the ONTIP version. What ONTIP version commit is that there are some ontological facts or structure, whatever, connects to the causal representation. Okay, I actually need to do 3 things. That's now I need 3 components. Sorry. One is the ONTIP part, whether you need ONTIP constraint for whatever epistemic account you're developing, whether you need ONTIP constraint or not. The second one, so whether you need ONTIP constraint for the account explanation you develop. And the third one is what Craver actually thinks. And so my talk primarily address the first one. Whatever epistemic account of scientific practice, in this case is the account of epistemic success of scientific practice, do your account require some ONTIP constraint? I say yes. That's the view I'm developing in my paper. And so is Portacini. And then it relates to Alessio's question earlier, is that I think I really need to emphasize a lot in my paper, is that I'm not endorsing a mechanistic account explanation. The account I'm developing in my account is not about explanation as well. And so I use the standard from Craver and Darden as mainly really it's about the epistemic standards there. And the part how the anti-constraint figures in it's not fully developed in the paper, but if I really need to go into, I have to digress to analysis of what understanding is, and that would be another paper. But let me just say something real quick, that if you follow Portacini's analysis of understanding, and she draws down the other account as well, in this direction, it's very easy to fit in the ontological constraint there. It's not purely epistemic view. So a short answer to the question, what I do have an intention to provide some imply some account of understanding that have both ontic and epistemic constraint in there at the same time. But it's not really developed in the paper, and it's not the main focus in the paper. And of course, and then really emphasize that I'm not endorsing mechanistic account of explanation. Developing account of explanation is not a focus of this paper.
Great, correct. So, question number 4.
Yeah, which is just very general question again. A quick question to capture the overall gist of the paper more clearly. What's the take-home message? Is it merely that leaving out details is sometimes okay? If so, when is it okay and when not? If not, what's the crucial message? So
yeah. So I think I hope after listening to my presentation, this question can be deleted.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I hope I make. And so I wrote a paper, and I do the slides. And after you do the slides, you always get some insight. Oh, how I can organize my paper better. So I think the take-home message is that you can have epistemic success, and then leaving out some causal detail, and it's okay. It's epistemically justifiable. And I think to bring broader philosophical messages, to emphasize that broader philosophical messages, that for philosophy and neuroscience, we love to see cases like that. And at least in my own research experience, I find myself, if I have that standard of being very complete and very realistic, a lot of case study I have trouble making sense of them philosophically. So I think that demand is too strong, and make it harder to understand aspect of epistemic success of neuroscience, for example. So I do want to work out that standards that can actually apply better to the actual neuroscientific practice. That's my goal.
Okay, thank you. And then Lena is going to see the presentation too, so maybe
yeah.
Well, clear.
We will put you in connection. So
thank you.
We have time for some further questions. If someone between the attendees has some curiosity or some comments, she or he is welcome to use the raise hand button. It's easy to individuate it. It looks like a hand, actually. But in the meantime, I'd like to make a question if I can. Well, I have two, but let me start with this one, and then we'll see. struck me is that throughout your paper, you never use, if I wrote it correctly, the word prediction or predictive. But I suspect that to scientists, predictive success is much more the common currency for evaluating who is doing a good job, much more than us as philosophers tend to recognize. I remember a paper from Yarkoni and Westphal from last year, or maybe 2017. They were pretty explicit in this. Whereas, I think that maybe for some good reasons, as philosophers, we tend to overemphasize explanation and we sometimes overlook prediction. Why is prediction missing from your paper? Are you neglecting it for some specific reason, just because you want to focus on something else, or you have something else in mind?
I think one quick thought is that maybe it's because the case study I focus that it's heavily built on this in vitro recording, and so the predicting part just naturally not comes out in this case study that much. So I do not have intention to avoid talking about prediction. I think, and I totally agree with you about this. Predictive success is a lot of times really a more common currency in neuroscience than talking about explanation. It is based on all the neuroscientists that interact with so far. So partly it could be just because the case study. Another thought I have is that maybe in the simulation experiment where they try to find a difference maker, if you interpret the experiment from different angle, and then you can maybe also interpret that experiment by showing that they can predict if the causal hypothesis is correct, they can predict that that's the result. Their simulation result is going to look like that. And then for me, that there's no substantive difference there. It's just wording difference. Like whether I use the code, where they try to find difference, how they aim to find difference maker versus they predicted that their simulation result is going to look like that. I think that would be just probably just wording difference.
Okay, that was my suspect. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We got a question from Michele. Okay, Michele, can you hear us?
Yes. Do you listen me?
Yeah. Okay.
Do you listen?
Okay, go on.
Okay. Yes, I'm sorry because sometimes my microphone didn't work. So I ask again, and I hope to have not missed the answer if you have already given. Okay, and I need some clarification, please, about the difference between abstraction and idealization. Here in the paper, you use idealization in two different ways. Indeed, you say that idealization contributes to epistemic achievement, saying something false sometimes, and some other times you say departing from truth, and that is different. Departing from truth can be the role of abstraction, so leaving out details. Meanwhile, idealization, I thought it was something stronger, such as saying something false, such as the Ohm law for neural connection, and saying something false that could be epistemically acceptable. So, and also in the example that you use for the case studies, I consider the second posit in component 3, that is an abstraction and not an idealization from my point of view. So there is a final question. First, I ask you please to clarify the distinction between idealization and abstraction. What is false and what is departing from truth? That I think it is quite different. And then I ask you if the criteria for an idealization that is something departing from, that is something false, if I mean correctly, because you use both definitions, is a role in the representation and epistemic purpose to which that representation is put. Here, in my opinion, we have not a clear epistemic standard to decide when an idealization that is saying something false about a system or a mechanism or whatever it is correct, and it is not too distant from reality, because you can have many false idealizations that are perfectly fitting in the representation and in the epistemic purpose, but being too much distant from reality.
Thanks, Michele.
Okay. So thank you for pointing out that when I put departing from truth, it actually can refer to idealization and abstraction at the same time. So I will fix that part in my paper. And my intended use of idealization is that strong sense that saying something false about the system. And then, so that brings you to your second question about the component 3. I think you are rightly pointing out that idealization saying something false about the system in some cases can fit effectively well with the epistemic purpose neuroscientists want them to serve. And then you mentioned that, but it could very depart from truth, depart from reality. I understand you this part correctly, right? You say like far away from reality. That's what you say, right? Assuming that is correct, there's some background I didn't bring in my paper. It's about when we focus on understanding. Well, it actually, again, connects back to my answer to Alessio, is that when we focus on understanding, it's really not about, get all the complete detail that almost like God's eye view about this all reality, all the footage, all the complete detail at the same time. That's not a standard you use to evaluate understanding. Understanding a lot of times more about I have some focal causal structure or patterns. I want to get it, and so that limited range of focus, and within this limited range of focus, I want to get as much a degree of correctness or accuracy I want, but it's never the all reality or all details. And so if I can bring in Pollicini's analysis in more, that she emphasized that a lot of time idealization is actually helping scientists to be able to focus on that focal causal pattern or structure they want to focus on. So in this case study, is the neurophysiological understanding they aim to generate, and that's their focus. So in this context, the most acceptable degree of correctness or epistemic acceptability you can pursue is to get those electrical properties right as much as you can. Knowing that it's all degree, right? So I keep emphasizing acceptable degree of completeness and correctness. But if in this case study is the electrical properties and try to increase the acceptable degree as you can, and if it's good enough, then that's good enough for the neuroscientist, neurophysiologist. Okay, that's my response.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Is there some other question? Because I have one indeed, but I didn't want to stall the possibility if someone else, but no one maybe. So my question is rather general, but I think that it underlies a phenomenon that is pretty evident in your talk, and it's even more evident perhaps in this discussion. It deals with the kind of task philosophers of science have to do when looking at science. I mean, on the one side, you can think of philosophy of science as a rational reconstruction, that is a quasi-historical work, which is a descriptive task. On the other hand, if you feel like a carnap-minded philosopher of science, you can try to assess whether scientists are doing a good job or if they have to change something, if they are making mistakes, and so on. Now, and also there is a third position which is very difficult to delineate, in my opinion. I remember that Beckel was trying to argue that he and, well, all the HPS, history and philosophy of science approach, tries to stand in the middle. They say, we do some history of science, but then we use the part of descriptive reconstruction to draw some normative considerations, which is it's hard to stay in the middle. Now, at the first look, it looks like your paper is normative, in that you're saying, look, scientists, are you doing well? But then discussion makes it pretty clear that perhaps your target is much more the philosophical discussion. So then it looks like you're kind of criticizing Craver and Darden more than you're criticizing the scientists. So you're taking a more descriptive stance, and you're kind of saying, look, philosophers, we're not doing a good job in describing this. So how do you conceive this paper of yours, and in general, what is your the approach you suggest for philosopher of science as respect to this?
You got me. I hide my hidden agenda very well. Well, sorry, not very well. I want to stay in the middle ground, and the first version of this paper is a complete structure in a way to argue against Craver. And I presented, I tried it, and I feel it's kind of like less interesting to just do that. And as I say, I then after that read carefully Craver's and Darden's 2013 book. I realized that at least in that book, they really handle a lot of the contextual factors there, and it makes me feel like it's more interesting to show if I want to stand in the middle, and with respect to this particular case study, which is about neurophysiological understanding, how can I make them my ally, my friends, my ally, rather than someone I need to definitely argue against. But as you see, there is I hide a very a layer back that if you agree with me and you kind of find yourself, there's something maybe Craver saying, for example, paper 2014 or in his book 2007, then you actually have to say Craver there is wrong. So I'm using later Craver to be early Craver himself, something like that. That's a convoluted plan I have behind this paper. But I'm very like your question is that I do want to stay in the middle. The middle is the best, something like that.
Yeah, you got to be a surfer then, because there are a lot of waves even in your paper apparently, and that's play the game. Okay.
Yes, play the game.
Okay, so maybe there are no other questions. Maybe we can. Well, I just actually Alessio stole one of my questions, so maybe that's with the one related to time. So I will just don't worry, don't worry. Just a brief curiosity. Another question about again about idealization. You mentioned the hypothesis that there is not a direct connection between the two neurons recorded by the authors, but an indirect correction via another neurons is an idealization performed by the authors. But intuitively, it seems to me that there is just a case of missing potential causal hypothesis in the study. So this is a case of idealization, maybe all the case of missing hypothesis should be considered as idealization. So what's the difference between making an idealization and simply miss something that is potentially relevant for a given study? And the second very simple point is, again, maybe you've already answered, what is the relation between abstraction and falsity? Because intuitively, there is no a direct connection between abstraction and falsity. So I would not say that the more abstract is a given model or representation, the more is false or far from the truth. So, for instance, take the sentence, there's a cat on the table, there are a lot of, and then take a picture representing a cat on the table. There are much more detail in the picture that are not present in the sentence, but I would not say that the sentence is less true than the pictures, just there are two cases. So intuitively there is, whilst there is of course a direct connection between making a false assumption, so idealization in your sense, there is not a direct, at least in my mind, a direct connection between abstraction and falsity. So what's your thought on this?
Okay, so the second one can be quick. Just I agree with you. Abstraction doesn't have this interlink with falsity, which is further support that if you use the idealization links with falsity, you can you can clearly distinguish the two notions. And the first one, I really like the first one question about clarify further that in what cases missing some hidden or intermediate causal factor counts as unacceptable. I think I can imagine a case relevant to this case study is that if they do this and missing out the unrecorded neuron 7, and in the context of so for example in the context of providing a causal answer to the question about in this particular neural circuit whether neuron 1 causally connects neuron 2. Just it becomes the context once the context set in this context, I'm trying to figure out this in this particular brain circuit I recorded, which has on this brain slice. Can I assert or make a causal claim that neuron 1 caused neuron 2? And if I was not able to show there's the existence of this unrecorded neuron 7, then I cannot support my causal claim. Mm-hmm. So in this context, if you don't take care of this possibility of missing some causal factor, then the evidence you produce just not good enough for supporting your causal claim. But in the case study I analyzed, that's not their goal. Their goal is to generate some quantitative measures to get started with. And so in this case study I analyzed, I think it's better to interpret that as idealization, and also think that it's acceptable in this context.
Okay. Okay, so thank you.